There was a sound the executioners in Paris had never heard before. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't crying. It wasn't the quiet silence of someone who was already accepted death. It was singing. 16 women were walking toward the guillotine while singing a Latin hymn. They didn't move like prisoners. They walked like believers approaching a sacred altar. The blade fell. One voice disappeared, but the hymn continued. The blade fell again. Another voice was gone, yet the singing did not stop. The crowd didn't know how to react. For months, people in Paris had treated executions like public entertainment. They laughed, shouted, and demanded more blood. Death had become something ordinary, something celebrated, something people had grown addicted to watching. But on this day, the square was silent. What they were seeing didn't match the spectacle they were used to. These women were the Carmelite nuns of Compiègne, 16 cloistered sisters who had lived away from the outside world for decades. The revolution had decided that their silence, their faith, and their refusal to break their vows was a crime punishable by death. Among them was Constance, only 29 years old and the youngest of the group. She had entered the convent 9 years earlier. Since that day, she had never stepped beyond its walls. The first time she saw the world outside again was at the scaffold, the crowd, the guards, and the blade waiting above her, and she was the first to step forward. Before climbing the scaffold, Constance knelt before the woman at the end of the line, the prioress. She looked up gently and asked, "Mother, may I have permission to die?" The prioress held her face and softly touched her cheek. "Go, my child." Constance kissed a small statue of the Virgin Mary hidden in the prioress's hand. Then she stepped past the executioner, lifted her head, and walked to the guillotine while still singing. She was the first, but she would not be the last. For nearly an hour, the people of Paris witnessed something they had never seen before. A city that had become drunk on executions fell completely silent. 16 women stood before death and refused to stop singing until their final breath. This is not a legend. It is not a symbolic story. It truly happened on July 17, 1794, during the bloodiest days of the French Revolution. And for once, death did not have the final word. 10 days later, Maximilien Robespierre, the most powerful man in France and the man who had signed their death warrant, walked up the same steps. The man who helped build the reign of the guillotine died beneath its blade. But the part rarely told is what happened before that execution. How 16 women who had never known violence were dragged from their home, stripped of everything they believed in, and ordered to abandon their faith or die. They chose to die, but before that, they made a vow that would echo through history and haunt the revolution for centuries. If stories like this matter to you, consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription. By 1794, France had descended into chaos. What had begun as a revolution promising liberty had transformed into a machinery of death. The ideals of freedom and equality were now buried beneath rivers of blood. At the center of this terror stood a man named Maximilien Robespierre. As the dominant figure in the Committee of Public Safety, he believed enemies of the revolution were hiding everywhere. He suspected aristocrats of plotting in secret, priests of holding illegal masses, and even ordinary citizens who failed to show enough enthusiasm during public executions. To him, the solution was simple: eliminate them all. Let fate decide the rest, though ironically, Robespierre himself rejected belief in God. In less than a year, the Revolutionary Tribunal sentenced more than 17,000 people to death by guillotine. In Paris, executions had become a daily spectacle. Sometimes 30 people were killed in a single afternoon. Executioners developed a grim routine: place the victim, release the blade, move to the next. When everything ran smoothly, they could execute someone every 2 minutes. At the Place du Trône Renversé, the place where the Carmelites would eventually die, 306 people were executed in just 6 weeks. The ground became so soaked with blood that it pooled between the cobblestones. Nearby residents even filed official complaints about the unbearable smell. Death itself had become a public nuisance. But Robespierre reserved a particular hatred for one institution above all, the Catholic Church. He saw the Church as an ally of the monarchy, a system that kept the population obedient and ignorant. So he launched a campaign not just against political enemies, but against faith itself. Churches were closed or converted into so-called temples of reason. Priests were forced to publicly renounce their vows or face execution. Religious holidays were abolished. Even the calendar was redesigned in an attempt to erase all traces of Christianity. Under the new revolutionary laws, simply wearing religious clothing could be considered a crime punishable by death. For the 16 Carmelite nuns living quietly in their convent in Compiègne, about 50 miles from Paris, it meant only one thing. Their death sentence was simply waiting to be written. In September 1792, soldiers arrived and forced the nuns out of their convent. They were pushed into the streets, banned from wearing their religious habits, and forbidden to live together as a community. But their prioress, Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, refused to let the group fall apart. She quietly arranged 4 small apartments in the town where the sisters could continue living in secret. There, they carried on their prayers quietly and tried to maintain their religious life out of sight. Then, Mother Teresa did something remarkable. She gathered the sisters together and asked them a difficult question. Would they be willing to offer their lives as a sacrifice for France? She was not asking them to seek death, but to accept it if it came, to offer their suffering in the hope that the bloodshed in the country might finally end. 2 of the older nuns hesitated at first. The idea seemed extreme, almost unthinkable. Mother Teresa told them to take time to pray and reflect. Within a few hours they returned, apologizing for their fear and asking to join the vow. In the end, the entire community agreed unanimously. From that day forward, every morning at 4 o'clock, the 16 Carmelites renewed their offering in prayer. They asked that if their deaths could somehow bring peace to France, God would accept their sacrifice. They had no idea when death might come. They only knew they were prepared. For 2 years they lived this way, praying, hiding, and watching as the reign of terror swallowed the world around them. Then, in June 1794, someone betrayed them. On June 21, 1794, soldiers broke down their door before sunrise. Someone had reported them, perhaps a neighbor, a shopkeeper, or someone hoping to collect the government reward for exposing hidden religious believers. 2 years of careful secrecy collapsed because of a single whisper. The soldiers searched everything. They discovered letters, prayer books, religious medals, and a small statue of the Virgin Mary, proof that the women were still living as nuns. The charges against them were fanaticism and counter-revolutionary activity. In simpler terms, their real crime was praying. All 16 sisters were taken to a former convent that had been turned into a prison. The irony was painful. Nuns imprisoned inside a building that had once sheltered women just like them. But something unusual began to happen behind those prison walls. Other prisoners started to notice the Carmelites. In a place filled with despair, where people cried, panicked, and slowly lost their sanity, these 16 women behaved differently. They continued their daily prayers. They still woke up at 4 in the morning, just as they always had. They sang hymns quietly inside their cells, and they comforted the other prisoners who were overwhelmed with fear. English Benedictine nuns who were imprisoned in the same building later wrote about them. They said the Carmelites looked as if they were preparing for a wedding, not for an execution. On July 12th, guards arrived to take them to Paris for their trial. There was a small complication. Their normal civilian clothes were being washed, so they had to travel wearing their religious habits. Those were the very clothes that had now been declared illegal. The journey to Paris took several hours in open carts. Some people in the crowd shouted insults at them, but the Carmelites did not hide or show fear. Instead, they sang hymns throughout the entire journey. Their voices carried clearly over the noise of the crowd. By the time they arrived in Paris, they had already become something the revolution did not quite know how to deal with. The trial itself was a complete farce. Everyone in the courtroom understood that. Revolutionary trials offered no presumption of innocence. There were no real defense lawyers. There was no possibility of appeal. There was no real chance to survive. The verdict had already been decided before the trial even began. The tribunal existed mainly to give a thin appearance of legality to what was essentially government-approved killing. The prosecutor was Antoine Fouquier-Tinville. He was a man who had already sent hundreds of people to their deaths without losing sleep. He had prosecuted Queen Marie Antoinette. He had also sent scientists, poets, and generals to the guillotine with the same cold indifference. To him, the 16 women standing in front of him were simply another group of names to process. He read the charges in a flat voice, almost like someone reading a shopping list. The Carmelites were accused of religious fanaticism. They were also accused of hiding weapons. They were accused of supporting the monarchy, and they were accused of communicating with enemies of the Republic. The claim that they possessed weapons would have been almost funny if the situation had not been so serious. The only weapons found in their apartments were religious medals. There were also pictures of saints, prayer books, rosaries, and a small statue of the Virgin Mary. In the eyes of the revolution, these objects were treated like dangerous contraband. But one moment during the trial stood out. Witnesses remembered it for many years afterward. When Mother Teresa heard the word fanaticism, she suddenly interrupted the proceedings. The entire courtroom fell silent. Defendants were not supposed to interrupt the trial. They were expected to stand quietly and accept whatever judgment came. But Mother Teresa spoke calmly. Her voice sounded almost curious. She politely asked the prosecutor to explain what he meant by that word. Fouquier-Tinville looked at her with irritation, as if an insect had dared to speak. He replied that it meant her attachment to childish beliefs and foolish religious practices. A quiet murmur spread across the courtroom. Everyone expected Mother Teresa to apologize. People assumed she would beg for mercy or try to defend herself.
She smiled softly. It wasn't nervous and it wasn't defiant. It was the calm smile of someone who had just heard confirmation of something she had long believed to be true. If believing in God was considered fanaticism, then she accepted the charge. Yes, she was guilty, and so were the others. They were ready to die with that guilt if necessary. The tribunal then asked every nun the same question. Would they give up their vows, reject their faith, and swear loyalty to the Republic? This was their final opportunity to escape death. The way out was right in front of them. All it required was one word, one denial of everything they believed in, and they could leave the courtroom alive. They could return to their families and continue living their lives. The youngest nun, Constance, answered first. Her response was simple: no. Then Sister Marie of the Incarnation, who had spent 30 years as a Carmelite, gave the same answer: no. Sister Euphrasia followed, the same woman who had once hesitated when Mother Teresa first proposed the vow of sacrifice. Her answer was also no. One after another, 16 women gave the same response. 16 times the answer was identical: no. The verdict was then delivered: death for all 16. When the sentence was announced, the Carmelites did not cry. They did not collapse in despair. They did not curse the judges or beg for mercy. Instead, right there in the courtroom, standing before the men who had just condemned them, they renewed their religious vows. These were the same vows they had once taken quietly inside their convent, vows the revolution had tried to erase. After that, they began to sing the Te Deum, a hymn of thanksgiving. They were thanking God for the chance to die for their faith. The guards stood still, unsure how to react. The prosecutor's face twisted in confusion. This was not the reaction anyone expected. Prisoners did not sing after receiving a death sentence. Prisoners did not thank anyone for anything, yet no one stopped them. Perhaps even the revolutionaries sensed that they were witnessing something they could not fully understand, something that made their tribunals, their paperwork, and even their guillotines feel strangely small. On July 17, 1794, in the late afternoon, the heavy summer heat hung over Paris. At the Place du Trône, the smell in the air had become unbearable. Weeks of constant executions had soaked the ground with blood. The 16 Carmelite nuns were placed onto carts along with 24 other condemned prisoners. From the very beginning, they stood out. While others cried or sat silently in shock, the nuns continued singing. For 3 hours, as the carts rolled through the streets of Paris, their voices never stopped.
They sang ancient hymns, the Miserere, the Salve Regina, and the Te Deum. These were songs Paris had not heard in years, echoing through streets that had almost forgotten the sound of faith. People stopped in the streets to watch. Shopkeepers stepped outside their stores. Women leaned out of their windows. Children pointed at the carts and asked why those women were singing. Paris had seen thousands of prisoners taken to their executions, but the crowd had never seen anything like this. People who looked calm, even strangely joyful on their way to death. When the carts finally arrived at the square, the executioner was already waiting, Charles-Henri Sanson. He had executed thousands of people. Over the years, he had witnessed every possible reaction to death: fear, anger, despair, defiance, and total collapse. But he had never seen what he was about to see that day. The nuns politely asked if they could sing one final hymn before the executions began. Sanson allowed it. Perhaps he was curious, or maybe even he felt that something unusual was happening in that square, soaked with blood from weeks of executions. The Carmelites began singing Veni Creator Spiritus, Come Holy Spirit. 16 voices rose together into the warm summer air. When the hymn ended, they renewed their religious vows one last time. Then Mother Teresa announced the order in which they would die, from the youngest to the oldest. The youngest sister would go first. The oldest, including Mother Teresa herself, would go last. This decision was intentional. The older nuns would remain behind to watch the younger ones go first, offering them strength simply by being there until the final moment. Constance stepped forward. She was 29 years old and had spent 9 years in the convent. After entering the religious life, she had barely seen the outside world. And now the first thing she truly saw beyond those convent walls was this square, the scaffold and the blade waiting above it. She walked toward Mother Teresa and knelt before her for the final time. "Mother, may I have permission to die?" Mother Teresa looked down at the young woman she had guided for so many years, the girl who had joined the convent as a teenager, who had given up everything for a life of prayer, and who was now asking permission to give up her life itself. "Go, my daughter." Constance kissed the small terracotta statue of the Virgin that Mother Teresa had been secretly holding in her hand. Then she stood and walked toward the scaffold. The executioner's assistants moved forward to help her climb the steps, but she gently waved them away. She did not need help. Constance climbed the scaffold alone. She took her place, looked once more at her sisters, and continued singing until the blade fell. The crowd stood completely silent. No cheering, no insults, nothing. The singing continued, but now with 15 voices. Next, Sister St. Louis stepped forward. She knelt before Mother Teresa. "Mother, may I have permission to die?" She kissed the statue, walked to the scaffold alone, and the blade fell again. 14 voices continued singing. Then Sister Euphrasia stepped forward. "Mother, may I have permission to die?" 13 voices remained. One after another, the same ritual repeated, the same question, the same blessing, the same solitary walk toward the scaffold. Each nun gently refused the executioner's help. Each one kept singing until the blade finally cut her voice short. The crowd stood frozen. These were people who were used to watching executions like entertainment. They usually shouted, mocked the victims, and demanded the killings happen faster. But now, they were completely silent.
watching 16 women turn a place of death into something they could not even describe. The number of voices slowly decreased, 12, then 10, then 8. Each execution lasted less than a minute, but for the crowd watching, it felt as if time had stopped. There were no insults, no applause, no impatient cries to hurry, just thousands of people standing still, watching 16 women transform their deaths into something that felt almost like an act of worship. Sister Julie of Jesus was a lay sister who had spent her life doing manual work in the convent. She climbed the scaffold with the same calm dignity as the choir nuns. She had never studied Latin. She had never received a formal education in theology, but she knew the hymns by heart and sang them just as she had every day for decades. Then came Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified. She was 78 years old, the oldest among them. She had been a Carmelite nun for more than 50 years. During her life, she had lived through wars, famine, and the fall of the monarchy. Now she stood before the executioner who would take her life. She paused and looked at him, not with hatred and not with fear. "I forgive you with all my heart," she said quietly, "and I pray that God forgives you as well." The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, had heard thousands of final words during his career, curses, prayers, screams, desperate confessions. But hearing this frail old woman calmly offer him forgiveness stopped him in his tracks. She climbed the scaffold without assistance, still singing together with the sisters who remained. 5 voices continued the hymn, then 3, then 2. Finally, only one voice remained. Mother Teresa of St. Augustine now stood alone in the square. She had watched 15 of her spiritual daughters die before her eyes. She had blessed each one of them. She had held the small statue they kissed before walking to their deaths. 15 times she had whispered, "Go, my child." Now there was no one left to bless her, no one left to give her permission, no one left to hold the statue for her to kiss. She looked out over the crowd, thousands of silent faces staring back at her. Then she sang the final verse of the Salve Regina alone. Her voice carried across the square, over the blood-stained ground and over the bodies of the sisters who had died before her. When the hymn ended, she slowly walked toward the scaffold. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She calmly placed herself beneath the blade, lifted her eyes toward the sky, and the song finally ended.
The blade fell, and suddenly Paris became silent. Later, witnesses said it was the deepest silence they had ever felt. In a city that had grown used to death, where public executions had become a kind of spectacle, 16 singing nuns had done something unimaginable. They had made Paris feel ashamed. The bodies of the 16 Carmelites were thrown into a mass grave at the Picpus Cemetery, together with nearly 300 other victims of the terror. There were no grave markers, no ceremony, no prayers. Just another pile of bodies in a city that had lost count of its dead. But something changed that afternoon. Something inside the revolution had cracked in a way that could not be fixed. People who had been there could not stop talking about what they had seen. In taverns, in markets, and in quiet conversations on street corners, they spoke about the 16 nuns who had walked toward death while singing. They talked about the peace on their faces, about the way they accepted the blade as if it were a gift. For months, Parisians had convinced themselves that the executions were necessary. They told themselves that the victims were enemies of the Republic who deserved to die. But these women, what had they done except pray? The question lingered in the air like smoke that refused to disappear. 10 days later, on July 27, 1794, Maximilien Robespierre was arrested. His own allies turned against him. The man who had designed the terror, the one who had calmly signed thousands of death warrants, suddenly found himself on the other side of the blade. The next day, July 28th, he was taken to the very same scaffold where the Carmelites had sung. He did not sing. When the blade fell, witnesses said his scream echoed across the square. The reign of terror was over. Was it just a coincidence? The surviving revolutionaries insisted that it was.
They said it was simply politics, a matter of timing. According to them, the deaths of 16 nuns had nothing to do with the fall of Robespierre. But the people who had stood in that square were not so sure. Something had shifted. On July 17th, the terror had ruled through fear. Then 16 women showed that fear could be defeated. They proved that the guillotine only had power over the body. You could strip someone of everything, even their life, and still fail to break their spirit. The English Benedictine nuns who had been imprisoned alongside the Carmelites survived the terror. When they were finally released, they discovered that the nuns' civilian clothes had been left behind. They kept them as relics, sacred reminders of the women who had died. For the rest of their lives, they told anyone willing to listen about what they had witnessed. The Catholic Church did not react immediately. For more than 100 years, Rome made no official statement about the Carmelite nuns. Some historians believe the Church felt ashamed that it had not been able to protect them. Others think the story was simply too politically sensitive for an institution that was trying to rebuild its relationship with France. It was not until 1906 that Pope Pius X officially beatified the 16 martyrs. And only recently, in December 2024, Pope Francis declared them saints. It took 230 years. That's how long it took the Church to officially recognize what the crowd in Paris seemed to understand in a single afternoon. There is a cemetery in Paris where the Carmelites were buried. It is called Picpus Cemetery. The place is hidden behind walls and rarely appears on tourist maps. Even many Parisians have never heard of it. Inside, the atmosphere is quiet. There are trees, grass, and a small chapel where names are carved into the walls. Around 300 names are listed there, victims of the terror, most of them forgotten. But 16 of those names still echo through history. Constance, Marie, Julie, Teresa. Women who chose death rather than betrayal. Women who answered terror with song. Women who showed a city drowning in blood what real courage looked like. Every year on July 17th, a small group gathers at Picpus. They light candles, they pray, and they sing the same hymns that Constance and her sisters sang more than 2 centuries ago. Hymns like Salve Regina and Veni Creator. Soft voices drifting through a quiet cemetery, keeping alive the memory of voices that once silenced an angry crowd. 16 women believed that their deaths might help stop the violence. Historians cannot prove that it worked. There is no document saying the terror ended because of them. But one fact remains. 10 days after their execution, the architect of the terror, Maximilien Robespierre, was brought to the same scaffold and executed by the same blade. More than 2 centuries have passed, yet people still remember the names of the 16 singing nuns. The names of the men who executed them have mostly been forgotten. Maybe that is the only answer that matters. Maybe victory is not about surviving. Maybe it is about what you refuse to give up, even when death demands it. If you want to hear more stories that history tried to bury, subscribe, leave a comment, and keep listening, because some voices never truly disappear.